Hi, this is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large, and in this video, I'm going to talk to a former Mormon, or a foreman, to compare and contrast Scientology with Mormonism. I've been wanting to do something like this for a long time, because I've had many questions myself about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the LDS Church, and how its members go about their day-to-day lives, what its organizational structure is, and whether it's a destructive cult in the same vein as the Church of Scientology or Jehovah's Witnesses Watchtower Group. Jonathan Streeter has his own blog and YouTube channel called Thinker of Thoughts, which you can find links to in the description below. He's been an outspoken critic of the Mormon Church, but, like me, has been approaching this subject with critical thinking and reason, so I thought we might have a good discussion about this. In our conversation, we go over the South Park episodes on Mormonism and Scientology and talk about whether they're accurate or not, in all the details and everything, as well as the day-to-day life of a usual Mormon, and we also talk about destructive cults and how they come about. I hope you find this as interesting as I did in doing it. Let's get to it. So I guess first off, who are you? I mean, I don't know that people on my channel are going to know a whole lot about you. So could you talk about yourself briefly?
Sure.
And,
Yeah. So I'm nobody special. Both of my parents were converts to Mormonism, and I grew up in as traditional a Mormon household as you can have outside of Utah. So I was raised in Texas, and so it's a little bit different when you compare Utah Mormons to people outside of Utah. They refer to areas outside of Utah as the mission field because you have a relatively low concentration of Mormons, and so there's more missionary opportunities, and the culture is not as all-encompassing that you're growing up in. So I grew up with a large family. We were good Mormons, so my parents had quite a few kids, and I was kind of nestled in the middle there. And it was a little bit unconventional in that I did not go on a mission when it came time for me to choose to go on a mission like most Mormon young men do for 2 years, kind of after high school, before college. I had gone to college early and was actually finishing college around that time, and I had already met my wife or the woman who would be my wife, and was ready to apply to medical school. And so rather than going on a mission, I went to medical school. So that kind of started just, the classic Mormon family story where we got married very young. I was 19, she was 20, and started on our track to professional school, which you'll meet a lot of Mormon professionals because there's a strong emphasis on education, especially on the men, so that they can provide for a large family. And we just lived the Mormon life, having quite a few number of kids, overall 6 kids, and just got so busy with education and training and callings in the church, didn't really have time to think about a lot of stuff. And then around the time that I got done with all of my medical training and was in a pretty regular routine in the U.S. Air Force, had some time to sit back and really think about some of the things that I'd always taken for granted. And this involved, everything from politics, the meaning of life, philosophy, and then kind of looking with that critical eye towards religion itself and my own religion, and just started realizing that there were questions out there that I had never asked before, and that the internet made some of those answers available. And once I started to see that the things that I'd always been scared away from reading were mostly just early church publications, at some point the switch flipped, and I allowed myself to ask the question, what if the church wasn't true? And once you allow yourself to seriously consider that question and then look at things with a little bit more objective eye, it becomes very difficult to hold the church in the same position that you have. And so that started a period of just intense study where, you just become so obsessed with how in the world you could have believed some of the things that you have believed, how in the world such in-depth deception
Mm-hmm.
So that things that used to be integral to the church, you had no idea of living decades in the church. And I ended up
Do you
starting a
mean
blog.
do you mean like older practices that the church engaged in, or like what are you referring to? Give
Well,
me an example.
there's a number of different things. The one that affected me the most was racism. Um, you know,
Mm,
I grew up, and anytime anyone would say, "Well, Mormons are racist," I'd be like, "What are you talking about?" I've never heard any racist teachings. Everybody that I know, has a black friend or whatever, and why would you say that Mormons are racist? But when you go back and you start actually looking at the sermons, looking at the publications, looking at
mm-hmm,
things that happened, especially before 1978, that was the year that a revelation was, came to our prophet at that time,
mm-hmm.
allowing black members to have the priesthood. Um, you know, they've whitewashed that entire history, and now we even have our general authorities saying, how proud they are that Mormonism has always stood against racism in every form. When you go back,
Oh, so
oh yeah,
they've done a whole historical revisionism.
oh yeah, absolutely.
Oh, see, I didn't realize that. Okay, because I was going to ask you about the progressiveness of the church and the fact that it had changed certain policies like the racism. What do they call that? Mark of Cain or something? That the black
Well,
people, what was that?
it's complicated, but the
Okay,
mark, the curse of Cain, is one aspect of it, and that
okay,
being something that anyone with even a drop of black blood was then restricted as to the priesthood. That was part of the theology.
right. Up until 1978, which, is a while ago at this point, but I mean, I don't know, it's within my lifetime. I don't think it was that long ago. Um, okay, yeah, because that's an interesting point. I did not know about the historical revisionism. I thought that change had happened, and everybody within the Mormon world knew, oh yeah, well, we used to be a bunch of racist pigs, but now we're not.
Well, the thing is, when you grow up in the church, you're just taught that there was a revelation, and just like Christ and the apostles first brought the gospel to the Jews and then opened it up to the Gentiles, it's the same thing. And so it's a natural progression. There's nothing wrong with the fact that blacks were for a period of time restricted from the priesthood, and then later they got it. That's a natural progression. But when you go back and you actually look at it, it's much more than just restricting priesthood. I mean, that meant that
Mhm.
a black family sitting in the pews next to a white family did not feel secure that they would have an eternal family, because the white family could go to the temple because they had the priesthood.
Mhm.
They knew they had an eternal family, whereas the black family, who may have been just as righteous, paid just as much tithing and so forth, didn't have that same security. And
Right.
it just pervades the whole culture. And so
Interesting. I guess
that
that
was
would
part.
be, because I want to do a little compare and contrast while we're talking about this stuff with Scientology, and it's interesting hearing what you're saying. That I'm sort of getting the idea that maybe this would be sort of similar to if Scientologists suddenly acknowledged that psychiatry wasn't so bad. Like, oh, whoa,
Yeah.
because these are people. I mean, we never let psychiatrists into the membership, but
Mhm.
um, but a similar sort of stigma attached
Yeah.
to this whole class of people for no other reason than the profession that they're in. Of course, with black people, it's for the race that they were born into. They didn't have any choice at
Right.
all in that. But still, interesting. Well, let's segue into something here because I want to talk about some of the beliefs, and I am coming at this in ignorance. I am professed ignorance. I know some things. I have looked in and read some things, but I'm going to assume that I don't know a whole lot about this compared to you who have lived it.
Hmm.
So I guess my first question is South Park's representation of Mormonism. Is that basically correct? I know you did a video or two where you talked about this in detail, and we don't need to get into that kind of
Sure.
detail, but in broad strokes, is that a good representation of the LDS Church and its beliefs?
In broad strokes, that is a more accurate representation specifically of how the Book of Mormon was translated.
Mm-hmm.
It's a more accurate representation than the church provided me my entire life.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
yeah,
Oh,
and
wow.
and this is not uncommon. A lot of people were woken up by that. Where, I mean, when I first watched it, and you see Joseph Smith put his head into the hat and
Yes.
start talking about that,
Yes.
like that was like I saw that, I'm like, that's a total lie. That's completely made up. But then when you go and you actually research it, It's true. And I remember seeing an interview with the Matt Stone and Trey Parker where they were
Yeah.
like, yeah, we wanted to depict it right. So we went and looked at the historical records to make sure we got it right. So for them, they thought that Mormons knew this. They didn't realize
Right.
that they were uncovering the whitewashing.
Right.
And so the church, since that came out and it became part of the discourse of, all the kids who watch South Park who are Mormons, asking questions about it, the church has become more open. They've actually shown pictures of the stone,
Right.
and they've published a narrative that does include the hat.
That's what I call the Mormon hat trick.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
Exactly.
pretty dumb. That, and it's funny how South Park has been such a cultural thing for you and me, because of course, the Out of the Closet episode they did where they, cartoonize the entire Xenu narrative. And that is not, the Xenu narrative is so misrepresented in the world at large because everybody thinks that's what all Scientologists believe. So it doesn't totally, again, this is a point of slight difference between, the Mormonism where, Mormons really do believe that this is how this all went down. But then again, maybe not, because you didn't know about the hat thing.
Well, yeah, I think the hat thing is different from Xenu in that I think there's a stronger parallel in Mormonism about that kind of deep doctrine.
Yeah.
And you'll see this in a lot of different groups where they have a milk before meat philosophy, where you don't introduce some of the more difficult and deep doctrine to people who are investigating or first exposed to it.
Right.
And so and this happens both in Mormonism, it happens to investigators, so maybe adults who are just becoming exposed to the church, but it also happens to children who are raised in the church.
Mm-hmm.
And that centers around the temple and the ceremony in the temple. And there's kind of a melodrama or a play that's part of that ceremony that talks about how the world is created and how the first humans on earth interacted with God. And that story, that narrative, and the different ordinances that are part of that ceremony are held away, and they're specifically not discussed with new members,
Mm-hmm.
and they're not discussed with children. And the way you can tell that this is kind of a secret doctrine is you'll have there's a person by the name of New Name Noah who went in and secretly videotaped the temple ceremony and put it online, and you'll have youth who are active church-going members of the church who will post on the video, this is totally made up. This isn't part of Mormonism. And that's because they have not yet gone through the process of going to the temple, and it's been kept secret from them. So when I heard about Xenu, and I heard about that you had to reach a certain level before you were actually exposed to that theology, in the Going Clear documentary, the parallels to that, it's a little bit different level. I think you probably have to do a little bit more in depth in Scientology to get to that deep doctrine. But it's the same sort of thing where you don't realize that is part of your religion until you've already committed to it. And
yes. That's
the buy-in that you have. Yeah.
No, thank you for that clarification. It really helps make it clearer in my head how those things are parallel. And it's true, nobody who goes into Scientology, you're not going to hear about Xenu for most people, they're not going to hear about that for years.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to be active Scientologists, and if they watch Out of the Closet, South Park, or they read Time Magazine, or they hear about this stuff, or they watch my videos, they're like, well, that's not Scientology. Well, it's not the Scientology they know, but that doesn't mean it's not Scientology.
Exactly. Now, how do they do it in Scientology? Well, is the temple itself in Mormonism is treated as this thing that is so sacred that you are not allowed to talk about it. You're not allowed to discuss it outside of the walls of the temple.
Mm-hmm.
And it's done with a level of what I call kind of deep programming that make it so that even when I left the church, it was very uncomfortable for me to talk about it. And this is something where, as a man, you're given a secret name in the temple that you cannot even tell your wife.
Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah, your wife is given a secret name that you are told, because what has happened is that in the future, when you're resurrected, you call them forth from, to enter into the kingdom of heaven, and you have to know their name in order to do that. But there are parts where the compartmentalization of the doctrine is so strong and so deep that it, even when you leave the church, it takes a time to get out of. And I can't even talk with my family members about this, because as soon as I start bringing up anything having to do with the temple, they're just like, no, that's too sacred, I can't talk about it. So I don't know if there's that type of element with the higher or deeper doctrine of Scientology.
Well, let me tell you, here's how it works in Scientology: is you are told by L. Ron Hubbard through a lecture that he gave, and through the materials of the Xenu narrative, it's made very clear that if people are exposed to this information before they are ready for it, they will get sick and they will die.
Wow.
Yeah. So you are under the impression that you are going to mentally, emotionally, and spiritually damage these people with a very serious threat of even death, should they not be ready for this material, and then they're exposed to it. Now, there's, when you get to that level, the people who haven't gotten to that level yet, well, they don't know anything about it. So there's a public level lecture that Hubbard gave where he says he broke his back, he broke his arm, he went through all these physical contortions. It's not, and he doesn't say it'll kill you, but he says that it's, confidential for a reason, right? And then when you get to the materials is where you find out, if you're not ready for this, you'll get sick and die. But the sort of the legend or the mystique within the Scientology world on this is no one can ever say anything about it. They talk about the gains that they got from doing the level, what's called OT3. Is the Xenu narrative, and it's not just an exposure to that information. That's only the very beginning part of it. There's a whole other thing that goes on where you take that e-meter and you have to then exorcise all these, demons or body thetans off of you, right? That's where that whole thing starts. And that's the real hush-hush part that they don't want people knowing about. So once you get to that level and you watch something like South Park, you can justify the fact that everybody who watched South Park didn't die because of some other convolutions that you can sort of use Scientology to justify. But really, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
It really just doesn't. I mean, they have to do like all kinds of cognitive dissonance to make Hubbard's words still make sense to themselves.
Right. Yeah.
Because everybody should be dead.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm sure I can already think of just any number of explanations that could be given for that. But, as we're thinking of this concept where there are levels that you can almost imagine, like when you're starting, a secret club, you've got, as soon as too many people get to the secret club and you say, well, I've got to come up with a super secret club that then, then only a select number of those people can get to. And then people, you put some hoops for them to go through, and then there's too many people there. So now you've got a super, super secret club. And so I can just see how the level system is just conducive to that. You just make more levels. Masonry maybe does this with their levels. So in Mormonism, there's an aspect of Mormonism, you've got the general membership, and then you've got the people who go through what is required to be worthy to go through the temple and get that endowment ceremony, and then to get married in the temple.
There's something. Let me interrupt you for a
Go ahead.
So does everybody who gets married in the Mormon church have to go through that endowment process?
If you want to get married in the temple, which means then that you'll have the promise of your family being sealed together for eternity, then you do have to go through the endowment process first.
Oh, and that's what that marriage ceremony is all about. Then in the temple is you're marrying this person forever.
Right. Exactly. Whereas
I did not know that.
Everybody else in the world, when they die, their marriage to their spouse disappears, and their link to their family disappears. Yeah. But if you got married by the special privilege that Mormonism and the Mormon priesthood authority gives you, then things that are bound on earth are bound in heaven, and sealed on earth, sealed in heaven, and that's how families extend into the eternities.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah,
the thing is, when you go back, all of these different doctrines when you go back and study history, you can look at what was happening when Joseph Smith introduced them, and you can kind of see the psychological reason why they were introduced. Now, when I was talking about those levels,
Yeah.
he had a group of people around him that he introduced to this endowment, and they became members of what they called the Quorum of the Anointed, and they kept that secret because it was tied to the secret plural marriage doctrine at that time. Joseph Smith married, I think the number is around 33, 34 women, but he always publicly denied it because it was a secret doctrine while he was alive. But he also introduced an even more secret level, which was something called the second anointing. So your endowment, part of that was the first anointing, and then a super secret group he gave the second anointing. And with the second anointing, these were members that were given this secret ordinance that guaranteed their spot in heaven, so that nothing else that they did on the earth would prevent them from achieving the highest degree of exaltation, except for denying the Holy Ghost or committing murder. Other than that, they were basically, anything that they did wouldn't really count. And that practice extends to the modern day, but the church is so secretive about it. There's lesson manuals that specifically say, do not talk about the second anointing, do not bring it up, do not mention it, and don't guess about it or anything. But when you go back and you read early church documents, it's referenced pretty regularly. And so all of our general authorities, when we look at our prophets, the 15 people at the head of the Mormon church, they've all received this sacred ordinance. And so when you know what it actually means, that they feel that their position in exaltation and in heaven is secure no matter what they do, it kind of makes you think about what they might be emboldened to do. And so when you hear about lies and deception, something called lying for the Lord, which is a kind of a historical meme in Mormonism, where you can distort the truth, you can have secret definitions for words when you talk to non-members and to other people to protect the interest of the church. And
oh my God, there's a total parallel. Yes.
Yeah, if it's lying for the Lord, then it's okay.
See, in Scientology, that's an acceptable truth.
Yeah.
You tell what L. Ron Hubbard specifically called an acceptable truth, something the person will be willing to hear, that will be acceptable to them, regardless of whether it's actually true or not. Preferably, it has some kernel of truth to it, but in the end, it's lying for the Lord. Like
Exactly.
it's Scientology first, and its concerns and its PR and its good name and its reputation first, and then the needs of what they call in Scientology. I wonder if there's a parallel terminology here. In Scientology, it's the WOG world. Non-Scientologists are called WOGs. This is a old British term. I suspect Hubbard got it from the Navy, actually, old polywog sort of thing. And it's the uninitiated, the people who don't know. They don't have, they're not Scientologists, right? I used to call them Muggles.
Yes, exactly.
Because I hated the term.
There is a
WOG.
parallel.
I hated
there is
WOG.
a parallel in Mormonism for that. And that is that you have to understand that Mormons believe that they are of the house of Abraham, and that the promise of Abraham in the Old Testament extends to them, and that they are part of the house of Israel. And so people that aren't Mormons are Gentiles. And so you're even though that's kind of a term you'll hear in Judaism or something like that, Mormons consider non-Mormons to be Gentiles. But every Mormon that has gotten their patriarchal blessing has been they're put into one of the houses of Israel so that they could be of the 12 tribes of Israel.
Interesting. Now, boy, so many questions here. So Mormons don't consider themselves Israelites or Jewish, though.
They don't consider themselves to be genetically Jewish, although a few older prophets have actually said that something changes in the blood, but that's not something that you'll hear talked about now. But they do consider themselves to be adopted into the house of Israel and beneficiaries of the blessings of Abraham.
Okay, but they don't think of Israel as any kind of homeland or something like that.
No, they believe that they've established a new Zion, and that's a fulfillment of prophecy. So Zion is not tied to the Holy Land.
Right. Yeah, there's not really any Scientology parallels with that, because Scientology's goal is simply clearing the planet, meaning making everybody into a Scientologist. That
Oh, we
is,
have that goal.
yeah,
That's of course.
yes, yes. But Scientology doesn't have a homeland as such,
uh,
unless you're talking about Clearwater, Florida. But that's not a holy place as such. It just happens to be where Hubbard came to shore in the 70s and decided to
well,
buy the
I think
hotel.
Mormonism. Oh yeah, Mormonism started out where there was a literal gathering of the saints to a Zion, and Joseph Smith declared, like, I think a particular place in Missouri to be Zion, and then when they got ousted, he had to declare some other place.
Right.
And for a while, there was that concept that you did have to join with the saints, and then where they were going was a special place. But shortly thereafter, they allowed people to just basically, they're called stakes of Zion. So all around the world, you'll see local Mormon congregations that are organized into stakes, and within the stakes, small wards. So when you see a building, that's like a ward building, and each of those is a stake of Zion. So Zion is worldwide now, probably similar to what you're talking about with
Yeah,
Scientology.
yeah. It's a worldwide movement, and I mean, they're so small, but it's nothing like the size of Mormonism. But they pretend that it is. You know, Scientologists are amazing at pretending that they're much, much larger than they are. Did you ever see or hear anything like that amongst the Mormons, that they lie about their numbers, or do they feel they have to?
Yeah, I think that there was a lot of focus put on the impression. I think particularly in the 80s and 90s, there was this concept that Mormonism was the fastest growing religion, and
Oh
so
yes, oh yeah,
that was
definitely big
always part of the narrative.
Scientology thing. Yeah,
Yes. And then everything has to always be getting bigger. There has to be, the stakes have to be multiplying. And you'll hear the number of missionaries cited as something that's really, a positive thing. And even to the extent there was a period of time where one of the most recent things the church thinks of as a revelation coming from our prophet was the revelation that missionaries could go out on their mission at age 18 instead of age 19, and that women could also go on a mission earlier than they could before, which was, they could start at age 19, I think, instead of 20 as before. And so what this did is, right when they declared it, you have everybody who was waiting till they were 19 immediately entered the mission field, plus
yeah.
all the people who now could go earlier when they were 18 went onto the mission field. And so suddenly there was this surge of missionaries, and they really capitalized on it. We've got like 50 or 70,000 missionaries in the mission field now. But if you think about it over time, that number is going to go back down to normal, because you will no longer have this overlap of the people who are waiting with the people who can now go.
Of course.
But they don't talk about declining numbers of missionaries. They just kind of focus on that one surge. And now we're having the problem of, since we've got younger people who are more familiar with things like South Park and the internet going on missions, they're having a lot more difficulty with their faith, with staying on the mission. So they're having a lot of missionaries come home early because they can't handle the proselytizing effort in the wake of, the way society is now.
No, it's a changing model for sure.
Yeah.
We've called the internet Scientology's Vietnam, because they just can't deal with it. There's just nothing within the bounds of their policies and Hubbard's vision. It's funny, Hubbard had the idea that, that we're all millions and trillions of years old, that we are immortal spiritual beings who have lived life after life after life. And yet, in all of his policies talking about spaceships and intergalactic civilizations and intergalactic travel, and he liked to make really crazy claims, speed of light, that's not a barrier. We can go faster than that. Give me a break. These scientists on Earth are so backwards, they don't know anything. And yet he never, ever predicted the internet, right? He died in 86, and he had no idea it was coming. And you'd think, duh, of course, any technological-minded society would have a, near instantaneous method of communication worldwide. And that's what the internet is,
Well, it's interesting. Mormonism is they've taken things that were predicted and then said, well, that was the internet, or that was a cell phone or something like that. You'll see the picture of the seer stone.
Yeah.
And there's kind of famously one of the church leaders in a post held up his iPhone. And the story with the seer stone is that he would look into it and he would see the translation. So the letters would appear on the top, and then he'd see the English translation. And so he got that. But also, we have a book called The Doctrine and Covenants, which contains, like dictation of statements from God in the first person, like I, the Lord, say this. Those revelations were also received using this stone. And so he would look in the stone in his hat and receive those revelations. And so the most recent general authority said, this iPhone can provide translations and can get information from the air or from the internet, and it's just like
the seer stone.
The seer stone. And part of Joseph Smith's theology was, eventually everyone is going to have a seer stone. And in their seer stone, they're going to have their secret name, and the earth itself is going to turn into a seer stone. These are all like early esoteric revelations that people don't talk about now, but are part of.
No, I never heard of that. No, I did not know that.
I remember when I was, still a believer, I'm like, well, that's just like, they're just talking about smart technology, like a cell phone, because you just, how would a primitive mind perceive an iPhone? Well, they would probably say it looks kind of like stone. It looks like slate when it's off, but then you turn it on and the mystical spiritual light, shines from within. And so you find a way to, take folk magic from the past and adapt it to modern technology and just interpret it.
Wow. Yeah, a little hindsight bias going on there, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me ask you about some day-to-day here. How do in talking about Scientology, there's the sensational stuff, the beatings and the Xenu and some of the more insane kind of beliefs to it. But then there's the day-to-day. Scientologists don't walk around talking about Xenu, and they don't walk around beating each other up and this kind of thing. They just live in their lives doing their thing, right? Yet they have some pretty odd beliefs. Where the belief system is not really of what's a whole lot of interest to me, because I think people can believe whatever the hell they want. What do I care? But I'm wondering on a day-to-day basis, what do you have to do to be a member of the LDS Church? What sort of restrictions do you have to live under, right? Mm-hmm. And what happens if you violate those restrictions?
Okay. Well, I think, first of all, Mormonism has had a lot longer to smooth over the rough edges than Scientology has. Mm-hmm. So the things that you're describing about the crazy beliefs and everything, Mormonism had that in spades early on, but a lot of it has been smoothed over, disavowed, even if it's just by attrition. And so now I think the life of a typical Mormon is not going to be initially too different from, a conventional biblical Christian. They're going to go to church on Sunday. They're, you're still able to choose your profession. There's an encouragement for education, particularly for men. And so they can choose whatever vocation they can. They can go to, to college, unlike Jehovah's Witnesses, who are discouraged from making higher education choices.
Yeah.
I think in modern day Mormonism, you're able to choose, for example, to control the size of your family. You can use birth control. Now, historically, that wasn't always the case. There was a time when they really condemned birth control. Now, that being said, you're going to still hear talks about how it might be a selfish choice for you to decide to limit the size of your family, but we understand that some people can do that, and it's between you and God, and so there's less of a stigma than there used to be with that. So that's one way where your life might be affected on a day-to-day basis, is kind of the size of your family.
Okay.
If you're a woman in particular, then your life is, I think, even more affected, and that's specifically because you are from birth saturated with this idea that the way that you can best please God, the way that you can best fulfill your potential as a woman, is to be a mother, to focus all of your energies, all of your intellect, all of your interest in making yourself a better mother. And for some women, that may be what they would choose to do even without any of this theology framework around it. And so that's great. They actually fit very well and easily into Mormonism. But there are a lot of women who that is not the choice that they would naturally make for themselves. But because there's this aura of guilt and shame around choosing anything other than that, and that comes from the leaders, but it also saturates the culture, that you find a lot of women are pigeonholed into this role, and they feel unfulfilled, they feel depressed, but they still do their best. And a lot of times, they still have large families and a lot of kids, and they love their children, but they know that it's not necessarily what they would choose if they didn't have that framework around them. So I think women in particular are affected. If you were to take, two parallel universes, a young woman who's raised in Mormonism And then that same woman who lives her life without that messaging, that she has to make those choices about her life in order to please God, she would probably find much greater personal fulfillment in pursuing her own priorities than in having to conform to the Mormon Church's priorities and basically subjugate or suppress her own authentic identity.
Yeah.
So I think women in particular in Mormonism, because of that traditional role that they are, that they are given with the force of God, have their lives affected on a day-to-day basis. And you'll see that when they come out of Mormonism, just the freedom to be themselves and not to have to conform to that is important. Beyond that, other restrictions of Mormon behavior, the most obvious ones that you'll hear about, it's called the Word of Wisdom. And this is kind of the code of not drinking alcohol, not drinking coffee or tea. Those are and not taking recreational drugs. Those are the ones that you'll hear, the Word of Wisdom means that. Now, when you actually go and read the scripture, it allows mild barley drinks, which is beer, but Mormonism has taken such a strong stance against alcohol that they now say that even beer is forbidden. And it also, talks about eating in moderation. And so overweight Mormons would technically be violating that law, but it's never really adhered to or taught with that degree of adherence.
Okay.
That's probably one of the most obvious aspects of how your life is different as a Mormon. Culturally, they don't really cuss that much. Like even saying the word crap in my household was like really taboo.
That's you would not have been wanting to be in my house.
One of the cathartic things.
It's almost a tenet of Scientology to cuss as often as possible. Yes.
No. It would and it's funny because you could be having a very engaging, intellectually honest discussion with somebody, but if they cuss, that's it. It doesn't matter how convincing their argument is, because they introduce profanity, you're not going to listen to them. You're not going to engage anymore. So
wow.
Discussing something with a Mormon who still is in kind of the believing mindset, you need to be very careful about your language.
That is fascinating. I didn't realize it was that much of a thing.
Well, there's this whole meme about Mormon cuss words, which flip, friggin', all these things. Like if you ever watch Napoleon Dynamite, the whole thing where he's like, what the flip? I'll do whatever the flip I want. Well, that's because that is Mormon culture in Idaho, and he's growing up saturated in that. And
wow.
The screenwriters are Mormon for that movie. So
wow. Okay, so these are relatively interesting cultural aspects of being involved in the Mormon Church. Are there anything that you would call abusive behavior as part of the dogma of it, or that it manifests itself through its practice?
There is, I think, like you probably may have spoke with Lloyd Evans about in Jehovah's Witnesses, there, anything that's an overt abuse would specifically be, rejected by the church. But what there is there is a culture and reverence for the notion of obedience that sets up potential for abuse. And so deference to both your local and to the higher up leaders gives them a degree of power that can very easily be exploited by people who may be prone to abuse. And then the priority of the organization to save its reputation. Historically, there's a hotline, for example, that bishops are given. So if they hear about any abuse, their first call is not to law enforcement. Their first call is to the legal department of the church so that they can make sure that they do it. Now, I think they've restructured that process so it's a little bit more focused on protecting victims than it has been historically, but it is still the first call. And when you compare this with like the Community of Christ, which is an offshoot of Mormonism from early on, they've always been several decades ahead of the conventional Mormon brand in openness and transparency and kind of adapting to modern society. And so if you read their manual about what to do when the leaders hear reports of abuse, it is said you can call law enforcement first. Call us as well, but the primary interest is protecting victims and bringing criminals to justice. And so,
but that group is an offshoot of and not officially part of LDS.
Right. They're not the official LDS church.
Okay.
Right.
Scientology would call them a squirrel group.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, they're a squirrel
and
group.
there are hundreds of offshoot Mormonism group. Every time you have a major doctrinal shift,
Yep.
whether it's abandoning polygamy, abandoning racism, you always get kind of an offshoot that splinters off for that.
Right.
Other than that, in terms of abuse, when you study church history, you will see abuse all over the place. The way that specifically ecclesiastical abuse, the way that Joseph Smith would propose to potential brides is rife with abuse. The story that comes to mind most frequently is the story of Helen Mar Kimball, who was the 14-year-old daughter of one of Joseph Smith's counselors. He had taught his counselor this notion of eternal families and eternal sealing and eternal marriages and plural marriage, and that counselor had basically offered up his 14-year-old daughter to Joseph as a bride. And her initial reaction to that proposal was no. I don't want to do it. And so what Joseph Smith said is, if you accept this, then you will secure the eternal salvation of your entire father's household. And what she said is, with such a great promise, I can't refuse it. That's such a powerful promise. Basically, if I refuse, then I'm like preventing my family from getting exaltation. And so that's a degree of ecclesiastical abuse, of using the theology in order to coerce somebody who is not of the age of consent to act, in a way that they wouldn't otherwise.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
I did a post on there's a couple of posts on that on my blog, just to try to make that point. A lot of people will say, well, the issue is that she's 14, and defenders of the church will say, well, at that time, 14-year-olds got married, and so it's not that big a deal. For me, the issue isn't really her age as much as it is how he was able to obtain consent, because it was through a very coercive way.
Well, sure, it was almost a kind of spiritual blackmail.
Yeah, exactly.
Is exactly what that was. And that sort of thing happens all the time in pretty much every religion. You'll find instances of that. You do this, or your eternity is under threat, or, you will be, all the way through to you will be excommunicated or, disconnected.
You have the negative side where they basically confront you with the threat. You'll get kicked out. You will be damned.
Yeah.
But then there's also the positive way to do it, which is like, look at all these blessings you'll get if you do this. And they don't even have to give you the negative part.
That's right.
But it's implied in it. And that's kind of how Joseph operated in that regard.
God, what a child abuser. Now, in regards to that, actually, because I'd like to talk about some of these offshoot groups for just a second, because some of them are not groups where the apple has fallen so far from the tree. I mean, you have some of these polygamy groups in Utah that are, in trouble with the law, that have, guys are in jail right now. Some of these small, and these are admittedly, from what I've seen, fairly small groups. I mean, these are definitely extremist groups, and yet they are offshoots of Mormonism. They claim to follow the same kind of dogma.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's funny because when you go and you listen to those offshoots, each one of them claims a legitimacy for their line of authority and for their practice of the religion. And for the most part, I think the biggest point of divergence is going to be around the issue of plural marriage. When the church issued its manifesto saying we're no longer going to practice that, then that was a strong focus for people who believed in that doctrine, who believed that both Joseph Smith and Brigham Young taught that doctrine, and they taught it with such emphasis, saying this is God's law, and if the church ever departs from it, then the church is in apostasy. And so they were able to then say, well, we are sticking to the actual Mormonism. And so that's why you see them, they're still able to articulate a theology because they're still calling back to those first church members. And the thing is, when they do that, they also hold on to all of those early doctrines that the modern mainstream church has kind of smoothed over and whitewashed. And so in addition to the plural marriage, you're going to see them make reference to blood atonement, which is this idea that there are certain sins that Christ's atonement is insufficient for, and the way that a person can get forgiveness from them is to have their blood spilt on the ground. And so that doctrine is still there. You'll see something called the Adam God doctrine, which was something that Brigham Young is Mormonism's David Miscavige. He's the guy that came after Joseph Smith, who was very authoritarian. But his unique doctrine was this idea that Adam himself was God, and so that notion is carried over into a lot of those splinter groups. And then you'll find that they still hold on to a lot of the racist teachings about blacks not being able to have the priesthood and being cursed, because they're all still focused on that very early Mormonism, and they believe that they have the pure or the true Mormonism, and that they have real authority. And that's kind of the nature of that splinter.
That's interesting, because they would, it arguably, you could say they are the more legitimate Mormons, or at least that's what they would argue. Yeah. Of course, that might is right, and size has something to do, and money have something to do with it as well. So you have this large organization. But here's my question: what responsibility does the LDS proper, I guess I would call it, take for those splinter groups? With these guys going off with the same teachings or the historical teachings. Do they feel any responsibility for some of the,
Yeah, no. Actually, this was something that came up in an interview with who was at the time prophet of the church, Gordon B. Hinckley, and he was asked about these splinter groups, and he specifically said, polygamy is not part of my church. It's, we reject it. It's not doctrinal. And so when you talk about these polygamist offshoot groups, you're talking about something that is totally different. We are not responsible for them because, they're breaking the law. We don't condone what they do. And so there's kind of this deniability that he talked about, which I think is how Mormonism relates to that. Mormonism, the conventional Mormon church is not comfortable with them even using the word Mormon, because that's kind of their trademark brand. They're Mormons. And
well, so that's why I would think they would go after them to some degree for that, in the same way that Scientology is supposed to be going after these squirrel groups. I'll tell you, when Hubbard was around, these offshoot groups were the church took responsibility for them, and I'm going to run into some word trippery here. So let me give the whole thought. They took responsibility for them by going out and trying to destroy them. So that's not a good thing. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that that's what Scientology or L. Ron Hubbard did in dealing with those groups and spying, harassing, stalking, threatening them.
Okay.
I don't think any of that was okay. I'm not suggesting that the LDS Church should do that in regards to taking responsibility for these groups. But how can they just say, well, they have nothing to do with us, when they're very clearly operating on the older versions of the dogma of the church, or the doctrines of the church? Maybe I'm using the word dogma wrong, but they are, very definitely trying to be purists. Right. I mean, Joseph Smith would say, hallelujah, brother, you guys got it. You nailed it. Brigham Young would be like, yes, please carry on with the polygamy,
Well, yes and no, because I think both Joseph and Brigham, the key was on the authority. Who had the ability to speak for God? Where did that true line of authority come from? And so that authority includes being able to articulate a change in the mind of God. And so Mormons today, they revere their prophets. They follow those prophets because they respect that line of authority. And all of these offshoot groups are people who have claimed their own line of authority. And Mormons have been warned that that's what apostates are going to do. That's what false prophets are going to do. And so they can very clearly say, Satan has led people away throughout history. It's in the Old Testament, it's in the New Testament, and it's in the modern dispensation as well. And so it's very easy to separate yourself from that, because you can't take ownership over every kook who goes off and calls himself a prophet.
No, of course, fair enough. Yeah.
But the thing that you mentioned in terms of how they went after them, I think Mormonism does that in more of a protective, positive way. There's this there's a committee in the church that there's a BBC documentary where the the BBC journalist confronts some of the church leaders about this. I think it's called like Protecting the Church Committee or something like that. That is specifically for looking among church members for anybody who might be trying to pull people into some of those offshoot groups. Because this is something that does happen because Mormonism still deeply reveres Joseph Smith, and those groups focus on Joseph Smith's doctrine. You'll get people who infiltrate the conventional Mormon church, start talking to susceptible people and say, hey, there's this early doctrine. We should really be sticking to that. And they recruit people to then join the offshoot groups by claiming that they have the real Mormonism. And so the church has tried to protect himself from that. Now, Gordon B. Hinckley in that interview said, we leave that to the law, to the authorities, to law enforcement, to government, to go after those groups that are breaking the law. But if you talk to people in politics in Utah, the Mormon church has a very tight hold over the lawmakers and the law enforcers in Utah. And it started out as a theocracy, and it's been diluted somewhat, but the church still holds a great deal of sway. And so they may still be pursuing that responsibility that you're talking about, but kind of behind the scenes.
In regards to that theocracy, and the tradition of the United States being, Christian-based, majority of the population are Christians, right? How much abuse goes on in that? What have you seen or heard about that in terms of what goes down in Utah on that? Because I can't imagine that nothing happens there.
Well,
you know what I mean?
Part of the thing about Mormonism and Mormons is that they are so darn sincere, and they really take their theology very seriously. And there's such a focus on piety and on humility and on all of these good things that you hear about religions. I'd say a majority of the Mormons that I encounter are really good people. And this even extends to the leadership, even to the high leadership. Even some of the people that are apostles and prophets, when you hear anecdotes about them, maybe in their moments off guard, some of them may be rude to somebody or something like that, but they're still pretty decent people. I think that doesn't mean that there's no abuse. There are abuses. There are bishops who, every Mormon bishop is given the ability to have one-on-one private interviews with young men and young women where they ask them intimate details about their personal lives. And so I've talked to people, to women who are like, when I was a teenager, this 40-year-old bishop got me to tell about masturbating and asked me in detail about it. Or, I had to describe the fact that I had had premarital sex with my boyfriend. Like, I had to say where we had sex, how we had sex, whether I climaxed, that type of intimate detail. When you give a person the ability to have those private interviews, and they feel like they're supposed to, and they're empowered to have this because they got to get all the details out so you can really repent, then it's just a setup for abuse, and people take advantage of it.
Well, that's where my mind goes, because I haven't seen any group who has that kind of power, or power structure, maybe I should say, where human beings don't act like human beings. And I really want to, I have a very optimistic nature, actually, and I would very much like to believe that the pious, not cussing, non-coffee, alcohol drinking people are somehow better than the rest of us. But I kind of go, no, there's no way. Those
are superficial things, like those, not drinking, not cussing. That's obedience. That's not morality.
Yeah.
Like one of the things you have to come to terms with when you leave the church is, in the church, you're told what's right and wrong from these old men who claim to be prophets. You have to figure out your own notion of what morality is, because obedience is not a moral principle. We fought the Nazis, and their whole thing was obedience. Obedience is not a moral principle. So, have there been high-level church leaders who have been victims of sexual abuse? Yes. The very first Native American general authority was a convicted pedophile. That happened he was removed from his position, but that eventually came out. And so, to what degree he used his position to commit his crimes, I don't think we know. but it was certainly a possibility, and he was put in a position where that could have happened.
Well,
You know,
and that's the whole structure of what you're talking about. It's set up in such a way that it would be very hard to find out.
exactly.
You know, because you have this theocratic tradition, you have the law enforcement under the thumb of the LDS Church in Utah. I mean, I don't know that I'm overstating it when I say that based on what you've told me and other things that I've read. So if they are under the thumb of that, well, that's a pretty dangerous place for law enforcement to be when it comes. Oh, and then you have the abuse hotline goes within the church. There is no external body. That's the whole point of a police force, is it's supposed to police by being separate, not part of, you know.
Yeah. And when you talk about theocracy, that was Joseph Smith's goal. And we've had just a landmark thing happen in the last year. One of the last secret society that Joseph Smith formed was something called the Council of 50. And this was a group of men who swore an oath that they would keep their proceedings secret on penalty of death, who met and were planning what would be considered treasonous activities by the church under Joseph Smith. They crowned Joseph Smith prophet, priest, and king. They were planning on how they could escape the United States at that time by going to either Texas or to Utah, and we're also planning on trying to find ways to ally with the Native Americans against the U.S. government. And his whole goal was to unify both the religious and civil authority. And that, of course, is going to present a night, you know, it's going to be a focus for abuses of power.
Right.
And even though I said, you know, Mormons are pious and generally good people, that does not mean that there are not abuses. And there are certainly, you know, I think the shroud of secrecy that Mormons have historically enjoyed is getting lifted somewhat. We're starting to see leaks happen. A lot of them are mundane, but we don't know what is hiding under the covers. And certainly when you look at those offshoot groups that you're talking about, you know, polygamous communities, there are just complete setups for abuse. And there's a post-Mormon activist that runs this podcast called, I think it's Year of Polygamy. And she's become very much involved in activism around people trying to get out of those abusive environments. I think her name's Lindsay Hansen Park, and the stories that come out of those groups, just in terms of incest, of pedophilia, of all these different things, it becomes very clear that that system of polygamy, the secrecy because of its illegal nature, and then just the culture that goes along with it, are so abusive that they just don't belong.
I just have to say that my own experience within the world of Scientology has so many parallels with this, and believe me, the abuse is rampant. I mean, you have the church even had, and I don't know if this is still the case, but it was definitely the case, within Scientology facilities and Sea Org facilities, if you call 911, it goes to the internal security desk.
Oh, no way.
Oh, yeah, it doesn't go to police, right? And, you know, and you have this internal security force, you know, whose job it is, I'd say probably 75% of their work, maybe 80% of their work, is internally facing. It's policing Scientologists and Sea Org members on the Sea Org bases, right? And, you know, and the kind of abuses you're going to find in the world of Scientology definitely involve sexual abuse. There's been statutory rape and things like that have happened. But there's also, you know, kids who are part of this, like the Sea Organization especially, not going to school, not getting an education, not being cared for, parents not seeing their kids, and this sort of thing. And and of course the violation of OSHA, labor laws, safety laws, you know, things, I mean, of that nature as well, because there's a lot of physical work and stuff that gets done within in the Sea Org. So I look at that system and I go, okay, well, and Scientologists are nice people, you know, they truly, sincerely, like with every shred of their being, they believe that they are the most ethical people on the planet. They tell themselves
No,
this, you know,
Mormons
all
are
day.
that. What are you talking about?
Yeah, all day,
All
every
these
day,
groups think that.
right?
Yes.
It's literally in their scriptures, right? O. Ron Hubbard's spoken words. We are the most ethical beings on the planet, right? In the universe. Da 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 da. So
yeah, we have a chosen
you know,
generation, chosen people doctrine as well.
yeah, so you create this kind of mindset in people where they get the idea that the only rules that apply to them are the internal rules of the organization, and to hell with what the rest of the world is saying, because they're all going to hell, or they don't know the truth, or they don't have the light, or whatever weird expression you want to use to justify your us versus them ideas. How could you, it's a recipe for disaster is what it is. And group after group after group where you set this sort of thing up, there have been problems, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why I kind of listened to what you were saying, and I kind of go, well, yeah, I really would like to believe that the more that these guys are different, but I just can't go there, I just can't believe it.
Well, one of the things, like, how would you rate Scientology's ability to adapt to the changes in society, to the changes in expectations of religious organizations?
Well, here's the thing on that, and this is something I wanted to get your take on this. I wanted to throw this out there at some point here, which is this. I believe, or I have this idea right now, that almost every religion, every major religion on the planet, every religious organization that has lasted, I believe that they started as what we would call a destructive cult. They start with a leader or leaders who demand obedience, demand that they are the only authority who can be listened to. No one else can be listened to. They sort of inculcate an us versus them attitude. It's usually about power, aggrandizement, and money for the leader or leaders, right? Sexual favors as well, like all kinds of whatever it is that leader is trying to get, he's going to get from his followers, and that's the reward he gets or the service he gets or whatever from his followers. Now, this sort of thing dies more often than it lives once the leader or leaders of the initial group and the first generation of its followers die off. I mean, because you need a powerful leader to step up and take the thing over, right? I think the JWs had Rutherford. The Mormons had, Brigham Young. The Scientologists have David Miscavige, right? They tend to be ruthless people, much more visibly sort of authoritarian maybe than even the initial leader was, who tends to be more charismatic, a bit more... maybe not soft-spoken, but the kind of person that people are willing to follow. They put everything, their whole lives into it. If the thing is going to last, you need that authoritarian person to consolidate and iron grip the whole thing together and keep it there and hold on to those members so they don't wander off when the leader dies, right? And then if it's going to keep going, then they're going to need to attract people who aren't attracted by the charisma and personability of that first leader, because he ain't around anymore.
Exactly.
So your doctrine has to change to be more open, to be more inviting, and to get more people to come on board. And if you're too authoritarian, you're going to turn everybody off, right? So you have to adapt to that degree in order to survive. This is all my thinking on this as I've been learning about all this stuff, right?
Yeah.
So I believe that Scientology hasn't hit that point yet, which is why it's still a massively destructive cult, much more so, much more blatantly so than, say, Mormonism, which has been around for, 200 years now?
Yeah, since 1830. Since 1830.
So we're talking about 200 years. So now, if you don't adapt, well, you're going to die, right? It's not social Darwinism. I don't want to call it that, but it's just how things work. So, so I think that what's happened to the LDS Church and what's happened in Christianity and various other groups is that they have toned down. I would be very curious to see,
what early Christianity looked like, because I'll
Oh
bet
yeah.
you it looked a lot like Scientology,
Yeah.
because this is just my sort of working theory on the whole thing. But I think that is going to be the downfall of Scientology, because it will not adapt, and it's within its DNA to not adapt. It must do, its own writings all say we cannot change. We have to keep it static, and nothing remains static. Things always change.
It's
So
interesting because when I think about how Mormonism changed, it seemed like every time there was a major doctrinal shift, it was because the forces external to the church forced the hand of the leaders. Whether it was like, if you guys don't give up polygamy, then we're going to go in and confiscate all your material, you're going to be disbanded, and the troops will be at your door. And when I think about Scientology, like, you had your confrontation with the government, but you won.
Well, yes, yes and no, right? Because there's still all this social pressure on Scientology to change, not legal pressure.
Right. The victory, though, that was depicted, I think, in Glowing Clear, when you guys were doing all the lawsuits and everything with the tax, and then the IRS basically capitulated.
Yep, they did.
Well, then you were not forced to change.
No, that was not a doctrinal battle, though. That was a battle for tax exemption. That was a financial battle. It was pure economics. Scientology was going to disappear forever because it owed the government like $1 billion. I mean, it was an insane amount of money.
Okay, so that was a fight for survival.
Yeah, that was not a legal battle over disconnection, let's say, or against tearing up families or something like that. Right. Scientology's belief system does not call for overtly breaking the law on the part of its individual members. There is a legal branch of Scientology, the investigatory branch, which is called the Office of Special Affairs, that breaks the law every day, all day. Like, they just don't even care, right? Because they don't care about law, they care about Scientology. So they will stalk you, they will harass you, they will break into your house, they'll do whatever they feel justified in doing to protect Scientology.
Yeah.
That has been the subject of some legal cases, a handful of them really, over the last 20, 30 years. And the church has come out of that with First Amendment protection on some of its more harmful practices. But the truth is, they haven't really had a in the trenches, down and dirty, let's get in front of a jury and do this kind of legal confrontation on some of the worst stuff that they do, because they have such a amazing legal budget.
Yeah.
And their legal tactics are scorch earth, destroy anybody who comes at them sort of tactics. That they've gotten away with it. And that's a little bit of a different thing from the government giving them a, spiritus, fumitus, spamitus, okay, for what they're doing,
What is your take on the degree to which the changing social environment is going to affect change within the church? Because it sounds like you're not very hopeful that it will change.
Well, I'll say this. It won't under its current leadership. If Scientology is still around in 50 years, it will not look anything like it does now. Because it's either going to, one of two things is going to have to happen. Either one of two things will happen. David Miscavige, the current leader, who holds the whole thing in an iron grip, will either die or disappear or go to jail or whatever's going to happen to the guy. And it's going to fall apart. It'll dissolve. Because he holds all the keys to the kingdom, and if somebody doesn't step up and get those keys from him, literally, I mean the passwords to the bank accounts, the power of attorney, I'm talking
literal
about
keys, okay.
Literally, right? I don't mean acceptance from the followers. Anybody could get that. That would be easy. That's not the hard part of taking over Scientology.
So there's no like formal method of secession. You know,
No.
there's not like the
Nope.
papal convocation
Nope.
with the smoke or anything like that. It's like literally he is it, and there's no need to plan for anything else.
That is correct. And his personality is such that he has taken out anybody who's a threat or challenge to his power. So he has set it up for there to be no secession. So my thing here is, what I'm saying in terms of these two things is either one, he disappears or dies or whatever in the next 20 years, sometime within that time period, let's say, and it dissolves because nobody can step up. Or someone, or maybe like what happened with the JWs, a council of people step up and they get the keys to the kingdom because there's a lot of money there and there's no reason it really can't sustain itself if there is a stable power at the top.
Yeah.
They take over, they explain it to the followers, and they keep the thing going. And then they do a reformation.
Yep.
You know, and if they want to keep it going, they're going to have to do that reformation, because the way it's going now, it is toxic, it is hateful, it is an awful, awful thing, and the public knows it. It's a Google search away, right?
Yes.
And that's the difference between what we have now in modern times versus these older religions who flourished in a time when the ability to get information about them was word of mouth. It was not, or go to a sermon. You didn't have access like you have now to Joseph Smith's personal life, Brigham Young's personal life, their friends, their associates, everybody who ever had anything bad to say about them. Yep. All of that is totally available now. Had it been available back then, you and I wouldn't be talking right now. It'd be a whole different world, right?
Yep.
So
that's interesting, because I can definitely see how Scientology is not sophisticated as an organization if it does not have the infrastructure that it would need to adapt, to have multiple generations of leaders. Like, those are things that are essential in order for any organization to be perpetuated.
That's right.
And
that's right. And,
but
and
I don't know, the nexus of all the
he's made it impossible. So I am overwhelmingly curious about what's going to happen with this thing, and I'll probably watch it play out in my lifetime. But I really am curious about this. But I'm pretty sure that I'm right about my idea about religion starting as destructive cults. You know.
I think that when you start to study different groups like J-Dubs, like Christian Science, like all these other things, you start to realize that there are these themes that just show up again and again and again, these psychological levers that all these groups have figured out how to pull in order to get people to be bound to the group itself. And you realize that these are things that I think happen just as a natural evolution, because those are ways that people believe and come together. And so things like a persecution complex. Well, all these groups have persecution complexes because that binds people together.
That's right.
The whole ethnocentrism of us versus them. Well, that also gives you an insular thing. And so you start seeing these things happen again and again and again because they are effective. It's like a symptom of just the social, creature of a human and how they interact with each other.
Exactly.
And so I think that same thing that's predictable and reproducible, you're describing kind of a next level way of the evolution of these groups. And those things kind of have to happen. And like you said, if they don't happen, then they disappear and you don't hear about them. And these larger groups that we hear about now are the ones where that evolutionary process has happened.
That's right. In some way or fashion, that happened. I'm sure for every group, it's unique as to how they went about doing it, but they have to do those things. And for every group we know right now that exists, I mean, there's hundreds, maybe thousands that popped up and disappeared within a year, 2, 3, or the lifetime of its founder, and that was it.
And even when I got really interested in this, and I'm like, well, I want to find out all about all these other different groups, and you learn about ones that you never even heard of. There's one called the Children of God, and their doctrine involves, sexual abuse of children, but that's like built into their theology, and so it's accepted and approved, and they've gotten into a lot of trouble with it. And then you have the Brethren that you'll see in Europe, and And it's just amazing how many of these groups are out there. And you can, I think Steve Hassan talks about one of the most powerful ways of not only coming into some insight into how you were controlled by your group, but also helping other people realize that is just don't tell them the controlling ways that their particular group works. Show them how these other groups that,
That's
you
right.
and I both agree, these are crazy cults over here. Just show them how they control people, and then an individual will figure out that that's kind of happening in their own group, or at least they'll be primed to see that, hopefully.
That's right. No,
And so
very,
that's
very much so, which is why I like talking to folks
exactly.
like
I was about
you,
to say. Yeah.
because I
That's why
think
this
we help
conversation is
each
so
other.
important.
Yeah, I
Exactly.
think we help each
Yeah.
other, and I think that, I hope that through our work, we can proof up enough people in this modern age, which is in a way that we couldn't in earlier times, because of the proliferation of information and the ease of accessing it. I'm hoping that our work will be more effective than apostates of the past who would go off and write a book or start rumors or do whatever they would do while they tried to get on with their life. Because, you just can't help but wonder, but you and I, how we would have been, what would we have done in 1850?
Yeah.
I
I don't think I would do it. I have a blog, it's thoughts on things and stuff.
Yeah.
And so I'd research and write, but I'm just doing that like in my spare time. I mean, like you said, there was a time where if you wanted to go back and see the early writings of Joseph Smith, early publications of the church,
Yep.
you had to physically go to a library, you had to
Yep.
find it, you had to dust it off, and you couldn't scan it. You just had to hand write it down and everything. And now it's so easy to do. And I feel like people, like I went to your YouTube channel, you've just got this huge library of videos that are not like these, angry apostates trying to tear down. You're talking about logical principles, critical thinking, things that, someone can't immediately dismiss without really having to consider what you say.
Yeah.
And that resource is there now. So, 10 years from now, when somebody says, well, I was approached by these Scientologists, I want to find out what's going on, that's going to be there.
That's
And so
right.
I'm hoping that the work that you do, the work that I see being done in Jehovah's Witnesses and myself and other people in Mormonism are going to build up, as you say, kind of this defense where it's always going to be there. People, when they want to find out information, are going to have a more objective approach to what they're being told.
Exactly.
But the question is, how is the group going to adapt? Because, you're talking about huge paradigm shifts that would be required in Scientology. Well, have there been any destructive cults or high demand religions that have actually changed and survived?
Well, I think every modern religion we have has.
Well, this is the one that comes to mind. I think there was something called the Worldwide Church of God that started going down the line of just, expecting really extensive obedience and kind of just upping the ante of what they required everyone. And that was tied to their particular leader. And then the guy who followed him, the way that it changed, I think there may have been a council that changed after that, just like let go of all that stuff.
Yeah.
And said, all these claims were overstated and they lost a lot of membership, but they survived, as a much smaller organization thereafter.
Oh,
and
And I made a video where I answered a question of what would it take for Scientology to survive, or at least somewhere I talked about that, because when you get over 200 videos in your channel, it starts to get a little gray where you talk about things. But I said they got to lose the Xenu stuff, they got to lose the confidential stuff because it's just cray, and they need to lose the disconnection and the authoritarian ethics stuff and justice stuff that they do. Their whole internal system of ethics and justice is right out of 1984. And they need to just concentrate on the lower level, non-harmful services that they can provide that do bring some degree of help to people, and probably through this eventually maybe even lose the religion thing. But that's way down the road as far as that wouldn't necessarily be necessary for Scientology to become a kindler, gentler Scientology.
Yeah.
But I say all that with the reality that there's no way that can happen and still be what we know as Scientology.
Right.
So
it kind of like if Mormonism, it's kind of like one of the things that would have to go away in Mormonism is this doctrine of obedience. and the notion that there's a man or group of men who convey God's will and who you have to follow. And if you're ever at odds with them, then the problem is with you.
Right.
But the thing is, if you take that away, then that takes away what was special about Joseph Smith. And if you take that away, then what's the point of the entire enterprise?
Right. Exactly. It becomes an interesting sort of thought experiment, working this stuff through and seeing how it would work and where it might go. So, we'll see what happens. But hey, look, we're definitely, at the end of how long I wanted to do this, but I really, really appreciate your time, and I'm really glad that we got a chance to talk about this stuff. And, Lloyd and I have talked a few times on my channel. I'm sure that you and I might do this again.
Happy to, anytime.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you very much for being part of this.
So what'd you think? Leave me your feedback on this video, and if you're a foreman or an ex-Scientologist, tell me your experiences around what we were talking about here. I want to find out more about the Mormon experience, and more often than not, you, the viewers, are the ones who point me in the right direction to get more information. As to whether the LDS Church is a destructive cult, my opinion right now is that it's changed a lot of its more overtly destructive methods, and it's not a destructive cult in the same way that Scientology or Jehovah's Witnesses are. However, there are still characteristics of destructive cult behavior in the Mormon practice, and I think this deserves a closer view before I will make a completely definitive statement on the matter. There's this silly meme that flies around the internet that the only difference between a religion and a cult is how long it's been around, or how many members it has. Well, when it comes to destructive cults, I don't think we can make that determination on such simplistic terms, which is why I fall back to the works of people like Robert Lifton, Janja Lalich, Margaret Singer, and Steve Hassan, who lay out in detail what makes a group a destructive cult. Check out their works if you haven't seen any of that and you're interested in this subject enough to do some real research on it. I think you'll be very intrigued by what you find. I'm sure I'll be addressing this topic more in future videos. Please like and share this video around the interwebs, and if you haven't subscribed to my channel, now's a great time to do so. Thank you for watching.